The gravel crunched beneath the tires of my truck, a sound like grinding teeth in the oppressive quiet. I killed the engine, and the sudden, absolute silence of the place swallowed me whole. Here it was, the house, my inheritance, my last resort. From the road, it had looked merely imposing. Up close, nestled amongst a tangle of skeletal oaks and weeping willows, it was a behemoth. Victorian, with all the ornate, melancholic trimmings, gingerbread eaves, a turret that jutted out like a bony finger, and a wide wraparound porch that looked like it hadn't seen a friendly face in decades. A wrought iron fence, rusted and listing, attempted to contain the wild overgrowth, but the attempt was futile. Nature was reclaiming this place. Slowly. Persistently. I sat there for a long moment, hands still gripping the steering wheel, the leather warm beneath my palms. Grief had driven me here, a sharp, unrelenting chisel to my soul, carving out an emptiness nothing else could fill. This house, this colossal, forgotten structure, was meant to be my salvation. A project, a distraction, a new beginning, built from the ashes of my old life. I was an architect. I built, and I intended to build something magnificent here, something to prove I wasn't entirely broken. Taking a deep, shaky breath, I pushed open the truck door. A faint, almost imperceptible metallic tang lingered beneath it all, like old pennies left in the rain. I walked around to the back, unlatching the truck bed, and began unloading the few boxes I'd brought. Tools, a sleeping bag, a portable coffee maker, some blueprints for the initial structural assessment. Essentials. The rest of my life, what little was left of it, was still packed away in storage, awaiting a future I wasn't sure I believed in yet. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the grimy stained glass windows, illuminating a tapestry of forgotten cobwebs. Something faintly acrid, like burnt sugar. Or perhaps something sharper, like old blood. I told myself it was just the smell of disuse, of a house left to languish. I carried my boxes into what looked like the main living area, a huge room with a magnificent soot-stained fireplace and windows overlooking the overgrown gardens. The floorboards creaked under my weight, each step a protest. I dropped the boxes with a thud that resonated through the empty space. My voice, when I spoke, sounded thin, reedy, utterly lost. "All right, Raj," I muttered to myself, the sound swallowed immediately. "Let's get to work." My architect's eye immediately began to assess. The structural integrity, the potential for light, the flow of space. This place had bones, good bones. But there was also a pervasive sense of melancholy, a weight that settled on my shoulders even heavier than my own grief. It wasn't just old. It felt tired, burdened by its own history. A faint vibration, a low hum, seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the house. It was almost imperceptible, a frequency just at the edge of hearing, like a distant, industrial thrum. I paused, tilting my head, listening intently. The hum faded, then returned, a subtle, unsettling pulse. I attributed it to the old house settling, or perhaps the wind playing tricks on the ancient structure. Still, it left a prickle of unease on my skin. I needed to understand every inch of this beast if I was to tame it. I pulled out my heavy-duty flashlight and began my systematic exploration. The main rooms were grand but decaying. The kitchen was a relic, the library crammed with mildewed, unreadable tomes. Each door I opened revealed another layer of dust, another ghost of a past life. I ascended the grand staircase, my boots echoing on the wide, polished treads. The upper floors were a labyrinth of bedrooms, each one more neglected than the last. The light was even weaker up here, swallowed by heavy velvet curtains and grime-coated panes. I pushed open a particularly ornate, heavy door at the end of a long, dark hallway on the second floor. The room beyond was unlike any other I'd seen. It was long and narrow, stretching far back into what must have been an addition or an unusually deep wing of the house. The walls were unadorned, bare gray plaster, and the ceiling was surprisingly low, pressing down. There were no windows, only a series of heavy, bolted doors spaced evenly along one side, each one made of thick, riveted steel, with a small, barred grate set into its upper panel. A faint metallic smell, sharper here, permeated the air. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing the peeling paint on the doors, the rust blooming on the bolts. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't a living space. It wasn't even a storage area. This was something else entirely. The air here felt charged, heavy with an unseen presence. And then I saw it, scrawled in faded, almost invisible black paint above the first steel door, the words barely legible in the dancing beam of my light. Old Death Row Corridor marked for closure. My architectural aspirations, my determination to rebuild, crumbled in that instant. This wasn't just an old house. This was a tomb. And I had just opened its door. I pulled back, my breath catching in my throat, the acrid smell of ozone still clinging to the air around me. It wasn't just old stone. It was a memory, a residue of despair etched into the very fabric of the place. My architectural aspirations, my determination to rebuild, had crumbled in that instant. Drafts. I forced a laugh, a dry, reedy sound that died quickly. I was tired, that was it. The move, the sheer scale of the project, the lingering shadow of my own grief. It was all conspiring to play tricks on my mind. I needed rest. The next few days were a blur of unpacking and initial measurements. I set up my drafting table in what would eventually be the main studio, a cavernous room with tall, arched windows that overlooked a tangle of overgrown gardens. The light was good, even if the air still carried that faint, earthy scent of disuse. I threw myself into the work, sketching designs, calculating load-bearing walls, trying to impose order on the chaos of the structure, and, by extension, on my own fractured thoughts. It started subtly. My favorite drafting pencil, the one with the precise lead and perfect weight, vanished from the rim of my blueprint tube. I searched for it for a good 10 minutes, grumbling about my own disorganization, only to find it later, inexplicably, tucked beneath a stack of old newspapers on a dusty hall table I hadn't even touched. I shrugged it off. Must have put it there myself, absent-mindedly, I reasoned, though I couldn't recall ever doing such a thing. Then there were the sounds. A soft scuffing sound, like a foot dragging across a wooden floor, only to cease the moment I paused my work to listen. I shivered, rubbing my arms. The furnace wasn't even connected yet, so the whole house was cool. But this had been different. A sudden drop in temperature that felt almost deliberate. I walked over to the window, checking for drafts, but the panes were sealed tight, the air still. My rational mind immediately sought explanations. A faulty seal I hadn't noticed, an air current from a distant vent, even a sudden dip in external temperature. But the feeling of it, the way it had passed through me, left a prickle of unease on my skin. They were fleeting, always at the periphery of my vision. A movement in the corner of my eye, a deepening of the gloom that wasn't there a moment before. I'd snap my head around, convinced I'd seen something, only to find nothing but the dust motes dancing in the shafts of light or the familiar patterns of wallpaper fading into the dimness. My eyes were tired, I told myself. The long hours, the constant focus on intricate details, it was bound to play tricks on me. Grief, too, was a powerful distorter of perception. I knew that all too well. But the incidents began to accumulate. A specific, meticulously rolled blueprint for the main hall, one I'd left secured with a rubber band, was found crumpled and half unfurled on the floor, as if someone had carelessly dropped it. The faint scent of something like damp earth, or perhaps mildew, would periodically waft through the house, even in rooms I'd just aired out. I tried to ignore it all, to force my mind back to the angles and stresses of my designs. This house was my sanctuary, my project, my chance to build something new from the wreckage of my life. I couldn't let it be anything else. But the constant low thrum of unease, the feeling that I wasn't truly alone in the vast echoing spaces, began to chip away at my resolve. The logical explanations I'd constructed felt increasingly fragile, like a house of cards in a rising wind. My hands felt clammy, and a tightness had settled in my chest. There was a history here, one that felt heavy and present. I needed facts, not just feelings. My laptop sat closed on a nearby crate. With a sense of grim determination, I reached for it. If there were answers to be found, they would be in the records, in the forgotten stories of this place. I was an architect. I understood foundations. It wasn't just a draft. It was a presence, sharp and metallic, like the air after a lightning strike. My skin prickled, the fine hairs on my arm standing on end. I told myself it was the house, settling. An old structure, shifting. But the ozone, that was new. That was wrong. I retreated from the corridor, my footsteps echoing too loudly on the polished floorboards. The grand hall, usually a space of quiet potential, now felt cavernous and watchful. I rubbed my arms, trying to dispel the lingering chill, but it had burrowed deeper, a cold knot in my stomach. My architectural plans lay splayed on the large mahogany table in the drawing room, a testament to the future I envisioned for this place, a future of light and purpose. But the house seemed intent on dragging me into its past. I traced the lines of a proposed skylight, a new open staircase. Anything to anchor myself to the tangible, the rational. But the air grew heavy, thick with an unspoken weight. It felt like breathing through gauze. At first I dismissed them as the wind, rattling loose panes or sighing through the eaves. But these weren't the groans of timbers or the creak of floorboards. They were low, indistinct murmurs, like a conversation happening just beyond the threshold of hearing, a secret shared in hushed tones. I strained my ears, my pencil hovering over the paper. The sound seemed to coalesce, not from the walls, but from within the room, a swirling eddy of sound that brushed against my mind. Why didn't you? The words, or fragments of them, were barely audible, yet they struck me with the force of a physical blow. My hand trembled, sending the pencil skittering across the blueprint, leaving an ugly black line. I froze, every muscle tensed. Had I truly heard that? Or was it just my grief, finally manifesting as auditory hallucinations? It had been years, but the wound was still raw, a constant ache beneath the surface of my determined exterior. Only the soft thump of the house settling answered me. I walked to the window, peering out into the fading light, then checked the door, then the empty fireplace. Nothing. No one. The rest of the night was a blur of unease. They were louder now, clearer, and they spoke of things I had tried so desperately to bury. I saw her. My beloved, standing at the edge of my vision, her face etched with a sorrow that mirrored my own. But it wasn't her. Not truly. Her eyes were too wide, too vacant. Her smile a grotesque parody of the warmth I remembered. He was cloaked in the same bruised light that had filled the drawing room, an ethereal, shimmering outline that flickered like a dying candle. You left me. Her voice, a distorted echo of the one I cherished, hissed from the depths of my memory. It felt as real as if she stood before me. You let me. I shot upright in bed, gasping for air, the phantom image searing behind my eyelids. Sweat plastered my hair to my forehead, and my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. But the scent of ozone was back, faint but unmistakable, clinging to the air around my bed. I swung my legs over the side, my feet hitting the cold floorboards. My mind raced, trying to reconcile what I had just experienced. A dream? A nightmare, certainly. But the vividness, the specific words, the scent, it felt too real to be mere subconscious torment. This house was doing something to me. It was twisting my memories, using my deepest regrets as a weapon. I made my way downstairs, drawn to the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the drawing room windows. As I passed the large, ornate mirror in the hallway, I caught a glimpse of my reflection. For a split second, not my face, but hers stared back, contorted in silent accusation. It was gone in an instant, replaced by my own wide, terrified eyes. But the image had been so sharp, so undeniable. My hands trembled as I gripped the banister, my knuckles white. This wasn't just grief playing tricks on my mind. Something in this house was reaching into the most sacred, most painful corners of my being, pulling out the ghosts I had locked away. It wasn't just manifesting. It was targeting. It was personal. It wanted to break me. I shot upright in bed, gasping for air, the phantom image searing behind my eyelids. The room was dark, silent, save for my ragged breathing. My hands trembled as I scrubbed at my face, trying to erase the nightmare's grip. The vision of the decaying face, the hollow eyes, the whisper that felt like a drill boring into my skull. It had been too vivid, too real. I pushed myself out of bed, needing to move, to convince myself that the solid floor beneath my feet was the only reality. "It's the house," I muttered, my voice raspy in the stillness. The isolation. It was too specific, too alien. I walked to the window, pulling back the heavy curtain. The house itself seemed to breathe in the night, a silent, hulking presence. Sleep was impossible after that. I spent the remaining hours until dawn pacing, making coffee and then pacing some more. The morning light, when it finally arrived, was a pale, watery thing, doing little to dispel the lingering unease. The familiar lines and angles of architectural design usually brought me a sense of control, a quiet satisfaction. But today, the ink bled on the page, my hand unsteady, and the house felt less like a canvas and more like a cage. My gaze kept drifting to a section of the wall in the main hall, just past the grand staircase. I'd walked past it 100 times, dismissed it as just old wood. But now it seemed to hum with a low frequency, a silent invitation. It was ridiculous, I knew, but the pull was undeniable, a subtle itch under my skin. I grabbed a small flashlight and a utility knife from my toolbox. I pressed harder, and a faint click echoed in the quiet hall. My breath hitched. Carefully, I inserted the utility knife into the hairline crack. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating a small, leather-bound book and a bundle of yellowed letters tied with a faded ribbon. My heart began to pick up its rhythm, a slow, heavy thrum. This wasn't just old house curiosities. This felt deliberate, hidden. I reached in, my fingers brushing against the rough leather. I pulled it out, along with the letters, and carried them to the dining table, setting them down next to my abandoned blueprints. The diary was brittle, its pages thin as onion skin. The handwriting was elegant, looping script, but increasingly erratic as I flipped through the first few pages. It belonged to a woman, a previous owner, judging by the dates, which stretched back almost a century. Her initial entries were mundane: garden notes, social calls, the weather. But then, a shift. August 14th. I hear faint scraping from the walls at night, like mice, but larger, more deliberate. My husband dismisses it as nerves. He doesn't feel it. I swallowed, a knot tightening in my stomach. The scraping. I'd heard it too. September 3rd. They dance at the periphery of my vision, always just out of sight. It watches. My eyes darted to the ceiling, then to the corners of the dining room. October 1st. My energy wanes. My thoughts are no longer my own. It feeds on my despair, on the sorrow for our lost child. It wants to rebuild itself, brick by brick, from my grief. The words blurred. rebuild itself. This wasn't just a ghost story. This was a blueprint for a haunting. I flipped further, the entries becoming more desperate, the handwriting slanting wildly across the page. November 15th. I cannot escape it. It thrives on what is lost, on what is abandoned. How could she have known? Or rather, what did that mean? The phrase itself was so peculiar, so out of place in a Victorian diary. December 2nd. He is gone. My husband. It consumed him. Or perhaps it simply drove him away, shattering his mind before mine. Now it turns its full attention to me. It makes me question everything. Was it my fault? Did I bring this upon us? The guilt. It feasts on the guilt. I slammed the diary shut, the sound sharp in the silent room. This wasn't my mind playing tricks. This wasn't just grief-induced hallucinations. This was real. This house wasn't just old. It was alive, and it was hungry. The previous resident had felt it too. He had been consumed by it. And now it was turning its attention to me, to my own profound loss, to my own crushing guilt. A sudden sharp drop in temperature made me shiver, and the faint scent of ozone returned, stronger this time, almost metallic. I wasn't alone in the room. I never had been. I slammed the diary shut, the sound sharp in the silent room. My hands were shaking uncontrollably now, a cold dread seeping into my bones. This wasn't my mind playing tricks. This wasn't just grief-induced hallucinations. This was real. The realization hit me like a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. Alive. Hungry. It had been watching me, waiting. My first instinct was flight, pure and unadulterated. I had to get out. Now. I scrambled for my phone, fingers fumbling over the worn leather of my jeans pocket. A colleague, the estate agent, even the local constable I'd briefly met. Just a voice, a connection to the world outside this suffocating place. The screen glowed, a comforting beacon. I dialed the estate agent's number, my thumb trembling. The phone rang once, twice, a hollow, tinny sound. Then, instead of a familiar voice, a burst of static shrieked in my ear, sharp enough to make me wince and pull the device away. My stomach lurched. I ended the call, my heart hammering against my ribs. I tried again, this time a number for a colleague I trusted, someone practical and grounded. The line connected, and I heard a click, then a voice. "Hello?" it said, but it wasn't my colleague. It was thin, reedy, like a child's voice, but stretched and distorted, as if speaking through a rusted pipe. "Raj?" it croaked, and the sound sent a shiver down my spine. Not because it knew my name, but because of the unnatural way it was pronounced, drawn out, mocking. Panic began to claw at my throat. I checked the signal bars. Full. My battery. 90%. This wasn't a network issue. This was it. It was blocking me. My next thought was the car. The keys were usually on the small antique table near the front door. The table was empty. Not just the keys, but the small pile of junk mail, the spare change, even the decorative ceramic dish I'd placed there. Everything was gone, as if wiped clean. This wasn't just a presence. It was actively working against me. I checked my coat pockets, patting them down furiously. Nothing. I retraced my steps to the dining room, then the kitchen, overturning cushions, pulling out drawers. The keys were nowhere. It was like they had simply vanished. No, this isn't happening. I headed for the front door, determined to force my way out. The heavy oak door, which I distinctly remembered leaving unlocked after my last trip to the hardware store, was now firmly shut, the antique brass bolt gleaming. I tried the handle, twisting it with all my might. It wouldn't budge. I rattled it, then leaned my shoulder against the solid wood, pushing. It was like pushing against a mountain. My gaze darted to the windows. The living room windows, usually letting in a generous amount of light, now seemed opaque, almost black, despite the late afternoon sun outside. I approached one, pressing my face close to the glass. It wasn't just dirty. It was as if a thick, greasy film had coated the outside, obscuring everything. Every exit was sealed. A new, terrifying thought bloomed in my mind. What if the house itself was changing around me? I moved deeper into the house, my heart thumping a frantic rhythm. The floor was rough, uneven concrete, slick in places with a thin sheen of moisture. It felt wrong. This wasn't the elegant, if decaying, Victorian architecture of the rest of the house. This was stark, brutal. The hair on my arm stood on end. I felt an overwhelming sense of finality, of an ending. Every echo of my footsteps seemed to reverberate with the footsteps of countless others, leading to an inevitable, grim end. My mind reeled. This wasn't just a trick of the light or a power outage. This was an active, malicious force, twisting my reality. The memories, the diary, the locked doors, the impossible corridor. It was all part of a calculated attack. It was reaching into my deepest wounds, twisting them, amplifying the guilt that had been a constant companion since the accident. Always your fault. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against the cage of my ribs. I wasn't just trapped in a house. I was trapped in a nightmare, and the architect of that nightmare was the house itself, feeding on my fear, my loneliness, my unresolved grief. I was alone, truly alone, and the walls were closing in, not just physically, but around my mind. If anything, it had picked up pace, a frantic, desperate rhythm against the cage of my ribs. It was feeding, I knew it, on the raw, open wound of my grief, on the gnawing guilt that had become my constant companion. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford. Not with the whispers, the fleeting shadows, the persistent feeling of being watched. I needed answers. This wasn't just a haunting. It was a siege, and I was the target. My architect's mind, usually so precise and ordered, was a chaotic mess of fear and desperate logic. There had to be a pattern, a history, something that explained this malevolence. With a resolve born of sheer terror and a flicker of stubborn defiance, I began my search. No grand plan, just a frantic, almost manic need to uncover anything. I started in the library, a room I had barely touched, its shelves laden with mildewed tomes and forgotten journals. My fingers, surprisingly steady despite the tremor in my hands, traced over the spines, pulling out anything that looked old enough to hold a secret. I found nothing but outdated treatises on horticulture and dusty travelogues. The attic was next, a cavernous space under the eaves, smelling of dried wood and latent mildew. I rummaged through trunks filled with moth-eaten linens, broken furniture, and the detritus of lives long past. Nothing. Hours bled into each other, my search growing more desperate. My eyes burned, my muscles ached, but I couldn't stop. I moved through the house like a ghost myself, a specter of my former self, driven by a singular consuming need. I ran my hands along the stone walls, feeling for loose bricks, hidden panels. I pulled at the seam, my nails scraping against the old stone. The air that rushed out was stale, heavy, and carried that same metallic tang I'd noticed earlier, stronger now, almost sickening. It smelled like old blood and despair. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to seal the passage, to run from this house and never look back. But the architect in me, the one who craved understanding, who sought the hidden structure beneath the surface, pushed me forward. I had to know. The passage was short, leading to a heavy, iron-bound door. As I pushed it open, a wave of profound, suffocating sorrow washed over me, so potent it almost brought me to my knees. The space beyond was utterly black, but a faint, sickly green luminescence began to pulse, revealing the outlines of a long, narrow corridor. My mind reeled. This wasn't just a hidden room. It was a place out of time, a psychic wound in the fabric of the house. The walls were scarred, etched with countless scratches and faint, desperate carvings. The air was thick with the residue of forgotten screams, of lives extinguished, of hope utterly crushed. The entity wasn't just in the house, it was the house. Or at least, this was its heart. Images flashed through my mind, not just seen, but felt. I felt their despair, their final, crushing moments of absolute abandonment. The entity had not been born of a single tragic event, I realized with a sickening lurch. It was a slow accretion, a gradual congealing of every negative emotion that had ever been felt within these walls. This house, built on a foundation of suffering, had become a crucible for despair. Each life broken here, each hope extinguished, had fed it, strengthening its hold, solidifying its malevolent consciousness. It grew on grief, festered on guilt, thrived on isolation. It sought out those who were already broken, those whose internal landscape mirrored its own desolate emptiness. And I was one of them. My loss, my crushing guilt over what I couldn't prevent, my self-imposed isolation. I was a beacon, a perfect vessel. The vision intensified. I saw glimpses of past occupants driven slowly, inexorably, to madness. They hadn't just died. They had been absorbed, their identities stripped away, their very essence becoming part of the entity's monstrous being. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped. I was drowning in the collective agony of generations. The entity wasn't just a parasite, it was an apex predator, and I was its latest prey. Suddenly the green light flared, blinding me. I stumbled backward, crashing into the stone wall of the passage, the impact jolting me back to my senses. The hidden door was still ajar, the air still thick with that cloying metallic scent, but the intense, suffocating vision had receded, leaving behind only a searing imprint of knowledge. I gasped, sucking in lungfuls of the damp basement air, my body trembling uncontrollably. I knew now. I knew its origin, its methods, the fate of its victims, and I knew why I was here. I wasn't just vulnerable. I was specifically chosen, a perfect match for its insatiable hunger. The house wasn't just a place to rebuild my life, it was a tomb, and I was already half buried. It was feeding, I knew it, on the raw, open woo. But no, not anymore. Not if I could help it. That suffocating feeling from the previous night, the one that had pressed in on my very breath, had shifted. A gauntlet thrown. I was tired, my eyes gritty from lack of sleep, but a cold, sharp resolve had taken root somewhere deep inside me, pushing aside the paralyzing fear. I wouldn't just be consumed. I wouldn't just let it happen. I was an architect. I built things. And if this house was a structure, then it had weaknesses. I spent the next few hours in a feverish hunt, not for ghosts, but for facts. I tore through the dusty boxes of documents I'd inherited, ignoring the unsettling chill that seemed to cling to the old paper. I wasn't looking for wills or deeds anymore. I was searching for anything that spoke of the house's original construction, its history beyond the surface. Old ledgers, architectural sketches, anything that deviated from the standard property records. The entity didn't like it. I could feel its displeasure, a subtle tightening in the air, a faint metallic tang on my tongue like old blood. Finally, buried beneath a stack of brittle yellowed newspapers from the late 1800s, I found it. A slim, leather-bound journal, its pages filled with elegant spidery script, and tucked within its leaves, a roll of meticulously detailed blueprints. They weren't the official plans. These were hand-drawn, notations scribbled in margins, crossouts, and amendments. And they showed something different. A section of the foundation, specifically. A sub-basement, completely absent from the official records, labeled cryptically. The journal belonged to the original builder, a man named Elias Thorne. He spoke of the hungry earth and a presence that resisted form. And then a series of frantic entries describing a desperate attempt to contain the influence within a specific sealed-off area beneath the main structure. A structural trap, an architectural cage. He called it the heart of the problem. My heart hammered, not from fear, but from a burgeoning, desperate hope. The blueprints detailed a labyrinthine passage beneath the main cellar, leading to a small, isolated chamber. Thorne's notes indicated that this chamber, built with specific materials and geometry, was intended to nullify or at least diminish whatever malevolent force he encountered. It was a containment unit, designed by an architect who clearly understood more than just bricks and mortar. The next step was obvious, terrifying, and necessary. Armed with a powerful lantern and a crowbar, I descended into the main cellar, a place I usually avoided. The entity knew. It knew what I was looking for. The wall I found was in a forgotten corner, partially obscured by stacks of rotten firewood. It looked like solid stone, but the blueprints showed a hidden seam. I worked the crowbar into a hairline crack, gritting my teeth against the groan of protesting stone. A gust of impossibly cold air rushed out, carrying with it a smell that was utterly vile. A mix of stagnant water, rust, and something organic, decaying, but not quite dead. Then the passage opened into a wider space. It wasn't a cellar or a room, it was a corridor. The walls were lined with heavy, rusted iron rings, set into the stone at regular intervals, almost like restraints. This was it. This was the place. The words from Thorne's journal echoed in my mind, scrawled frantically on the last legible page. The ultimate containment. Thorne hadn't just built a house. He'd built a prison, or perhaps inherited one. And the entity was still here, still trapped, still festering. The implication was clear. The chamber itself wasn't just a trap, it was also where the entity's power was centered. And if it could be contained, perhaps it could be weakened. I spun around, my lantern beam dancing wildly. The opening I'd forced was now completely blocked, not by fallen stone, but by a solid, unblemished wall, as if it had never been there. The passage was gone. I was sealed in. The air grew impossibly thick, pressing down on my chest. The sound was like 1,000 voices screaming through wet gauze. Then, the heavy bolted door at the far end of the corridor groaned. A terrible, drawn-out sound of old metal straining. It began to slowly, inexorably swing inwards, revealing only deeper, more absolute blackness beyond. "Are you down here? It's the surveyor. I'm here about the structural report. Hello?" The entity's response was immediate and savage. The ground beneath my feet vibrated violently, and dust rained down from the ceiling. I heard a distant crash from above, a splintering sound, and then the surveyor's voice cut off abruptly, replaced by a choked gasp. The entity wasn't just reacting to my discovery, it was retaliating. And now someone else was caught in its terrible reach. A wave of bone-chilling cold washed over me, so profound it felt like every drop of blood in my veins had instantly frozen. The air, thick with the smell of damp earth and something acrid, pressed in. My ears rang with the echo of that unholy shriek, a sound that had not just assailed my hearing but had vibrated through my very bones, threatening to unravel me. I stumbled back, my hands flying up to cover my ears, though it did little to muffle the residual agony. Dust, not just a sprinkle but a gritty cascade, rained down from the ceiling, stinging my eyes. A jagged crack, thin as a spider web, snaked its way across the plaster of the nearest wall, expanding with an audible snap. The house was alive, and it was furious. The light, already dim, seemed to recoil, drawing back into itself, leaving me in a pocket of oppressive gloom. My breath hitched in my throat, each inhale a desperate, futile attempt to draw in air that felt suddenly too thin, too heavy, too wrong. Then, the floor gave way. Not a collapse, but a sickening lurch, a displacement that threw me off balance. I scrabbled for purchase, my fingers scraping against rough wood, but the world tilted, spun, and then reformed. When I finally regained my footing, my eyes struggling to adjust, the room was gone. The familiar study, with its stacks of blueprints and my half-empty coffee mug, had vanished. I stood instead in a narrow, unlit passage. This wasn't possible. This wasn't here. The entity wasn't just in the house. It was the house, twisting reality to its will, forging a prison from my own mind. It was a chorus of voices, overlapping and indistinct, yet each one imbued with a specific cutting accusation. You let her fall. You watched her go. You were not enough. My hands clenched into fists, nails digging into my palms. The image of her, my beloved, slipping from my grasp, played out behind my eyes with vivid, agonizing clarity. The entity knew. It didn't just sense my grief. It fed on it, tearing at the scabs of old wounds. But the entity merely laughed, a dry, rattling sound that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the corridor. It was a pressure on my chest, a phantom touch on my neck, the sensation of breath on my ear, though no one was there. When the light returned, momentarily brighter, I saw it. Or rather, I saw them. Within the maelstrom, I caught glimpses. A child's outstretched hand, a woman's tear-streaked face, a man's broken form. And then, clearer than anything, her face. But it wasn't her face as I remembered it, full of life and warmth. It was a sound laced with all the pain I had ever felt, all the guilt I had ever carried, amplified 1,000-fold. Why didn't you, Raj? Why did you let me go? My knees buckled. This wasn't just a haunting. It was a vivisection of my mind, a surgical strike against my most vulnerable fears. The entity wasn't just trying to scare me. It was trying to dismantle me, piece by agonizing piece. But even the wall seemed to breathe, to pulse with the entity's malevolent energy. The absolute certainty of my failure, magnified by the entity's assault, threatened to extinguish it entirely. And I knew, with a horrifying certainty, that it was only just beginning to close its grip. My knees buckled. The cold intensified, seeping into my bones, stealing my strength. I felt the foundations of my sanity begin to crumble, the carefully constructed walls of my resolve cracking under an unseen, relentless pressure. But then, a flicker. A spark ignited in the abyss of my terror. No, not like this. I wouldn't let it. I pushed myself up, my muscles screaming in protest, the air around me thick with a static charge that prickled my skin. This thing, whatever it was, thrived on my despair, gorged itself on my grief. It was an architect of ruin, and I, Raj, was an architect of construction. I understood structures. I understood foundations. I understood how to shore up failing walls, how to reinforce weak points, how to design resilience into a space. This wasn't just a house. It was a battlefield for my very soul, and the entity was trying to build its own twisted monument out of my shattered psyche. It wasn't just showing me things. It was projecting them, creating illusions that felt real because they tapped into my deepest anxieties. It was using my mind as its canvas, my memories as its paint. And if it was building something, then I could unbuild it. Or, more accurately, I could build something stronger to counter it. My plan began to form, a desperate architectural countermeasure. I had spent weeks studying the house's history, poring over blueprints, old deeds, local legends. I'd seen the patterns, the recurring motifs of loss and abandonment. The entity wasn't just a random malevolence. It was a cumulative echo, a monstrous composite of all the sorrow that had ever soaked into these walls. It sought to replicate its own brokenness within me. to make me another brick in its decaying edifice. I needed to build a fortress of self, not against the entity's physical presence, because there was none, but against its psychological assault. It was a battle of will, of design. I would use the principles of structural integrity, not with steel and concrete, but with resolve and memory. The very walls of the Victorian house seemed to ripple, the ornate wallpaper blurring into a uniform, sickly gray. The scent of decaying velvet and dust was replaced by something sharper, metallic, and faintly putrid. The familiar, opulent gloom of the hallway twisted, elongated, the ceiling rising to an impossible height, the floor stretching into an endless, narrow pathway. Suddenly, I wasn't in my grand, inherited house anymore. The walls were rough-hewn concrete, stained with what looked like generations of grime and despair. I knew it immediately, not from any prior knowledge, but because the entity had imprinted the knowledge, the feeling of utter hopelessness, directly into my mind. This was its ultimate expression of condemnation, its final act of psychological imprisonment. Dozens of heavy, rusting metal doors lined either side of the corridor, each one a grim mouth, sealed shut. I could almost hear the echoes of forgotten cries, the final, desperate breaths of men who had walked this path. This wasn't just a vision. It was a total immersion. The metallic tang in the air grew stronger, mingled now with the faint, cloying sweetness of rot. "This is where you want me to end, isn't it?" I forced the words out, my voice trembling but firm. Trapped. Condemned. A low, guttural growl vibrated through the concrete floor, rising from the very depths of the corridor. It wasn't a sound. It was a resonance of pure, concentrated malice. My architectural countermeasure had to begin here. Each thought of despair, each flicker of guilt, each memory of loss that the entity tried to amplify, I mentally shored up. I saw the corrosive influence as a structural flaw, and I began to reinforce it. I imagined pouring concrete over the cracks, bolting down the loose panels of my resolve. I saw the memory of my devastating loss, not as a gaping wound the entity could exploit, but as a scar, painful, yes, but healed, a testament to endurance, not an invitation to collapse. The entity recoiled. It didn't like this. My conscious act of resolving, of building, was its poison. I refused to look. I focused on my mental construction. I saw myself erecting buttresses against the insidious creep of its influence, designing load-bearing walls of defiance. My breathing became deeper, more deliberate. I was the architect, and this was my final, most crucial design. I was building a no-entry zone in my mind, a sanctuary it could not penetrate. The reveal struck me with the force of a physical blow. The entity wasn't a solid, unassailable force. It was a parasitic structure built on my weakness, on my unaddressed grief. It was like a crumbling ruin that needed my despair to shore up its own decaying walls. If I refused to provide the materials, if I started to rebuild my own internal architecture, it would starve. Its terrifying power was contingent on my surrender. The corridor began to warp further, the concrete walls seeming to melt, the metal doors dissolving into smoky tendrils. The entity was fighting back, trying to break my concentration, to drown me in chaos. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about reclaiming myself, brick by agonizing brick. The growl wasn't just a sound in the air. It was a tremor in my bones, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to originate from the very core of the earth beneath my feet. The bare bulbs overhead, already weak and sputtering, pulsed violently, plunging the narrow space into near darkness before flaring back with a sickly yellow glow, revealing my solitary figure, stark against the peeling paint. I could taste dust and something metallic, like old blood, clinging to the air. My breath hitched. This wasn't a trick of the light or a draft. This was it. The entity, no longer content to skulk in the periphery, was here, in its truest, most terrible form. The air grew heavy, thick like wet wool, pressing in on my chest. I felt a cold so profound it burned, seeping not just into my skin, but into the marrow of my bones. They didn't just deepen, they moved, twisting and writhed like a knot of black eels, growing taller, denser. It wasn't a shape I could define, not exactly. It stretched, expanding, filling the corridor, pushing against the very walls. I stumbled back, my heel scraping against the rough concrete. No, not yet. You built this for me. The words were a hammer blow, striking at the deepest well of my guilt. The corridor around me began to distort. The solid concrete walls seemed to soften, to ripple like water. The flickering bulbs elongated, becoming grotesque, dangling filaments of light. The smell of dust vanished, replaced by the faint, sweet scent of lilies. Then the acrid tang of burnt rubber, a smell that tore at the fabric of my memory, dragging me back to the day the world ended. I was standing on a rain-slicked road. The air was thick with the scent of wet asphalt and something else, something metallic and sickening. Ahead, a mangled vehicle, its headlights shattered, twisted metal screaming silently. And then, the sound of a voice, faint, desperate, calling my name. My lost one. The entity was trying to pull me under, to drown me in the very grief it fed upon. It wanted me to relive it, to break under the weight of that unchangeable moment. You could have. They came from the twisted metal, from the rain, from the very air I breathed. Your design, your flaw, your fault. My hands clenched into fists, nails digging into my palms. The pain was a sharp, grounding sensation. This was its ultimate weapon. My own mind, my own past, twisted into a cage. The images were so vivid, so real, the agony in my chest so sharp I almost buckled. But then, a different thought, a splinter of defiance. This isn't real. Not this version. Not anymore. I had lived this moment 1,000 times in my nightmares. I had let it consume me, let it rot my soul. I had come to this house to build, to create, to find a new beginning. I had been weak, yes, but I wasn't broken beyond repair. I closed my eyes, forcing the image of the wreckage away. When I opened them, the rain-slicked road was still there, but it was fading at the edges, shimmering like a mirage. It had expected me to shatter, to embrace the familiar agony. But I had pushed back. Then, a new tactic. The very structure of the house responded to its anger. The walls of the corridor began to ripple more violently, no longer just softening, but pulsing inward, as if trying to crush me. Cracks spiderwebbed across the ceiling, dust raining down in gritty sheets. The air grew impossibly thin, stealing my breath. It was a roar, a cacophony of distorted voices, all speaking my name, all condemning me. It was a chorus of my own fears, my own self-recriminations, amplified 1,000-fold. The floor beneath me tilted violently, sending me sprawling. I scrambled up, my hands scraping on the rough concrete. You are nothing, without your grief. It rasped, closer now, a breath on my neck. I am you. You are me. That was the reveal, the insidious truth. It was probing, seeking entry, trying to burrow into my very essence. I won't let you. I took a shuddering breath, forcing air into my burning lungs. My vision was useless, but my other senses flared. I could feel the solid, ancient structure of the house around me, even as it tried to collapse. I was an architect. I understood foundations, stresses, the integrity of a structure. It was a sound of defiance, not just against the entity, but against the part of myself that had wallowed in guilt for so long. You are not me. You are a parasite, and I am done feeding you. As I spoke, a strange thing happened. The house itself seemed to groan, not in collapse, but in pain, as if my words were a physical blow. The fight, I realized, wasn't just for my life. It was for my very soul. Not in collapse, but in a raw, visceral agony. The shriek that tore through the air was not human, not animal, but something far more ancient and wounded, brimming with a fury that clawed at the very fabric of my sanity. The faint shimmer in front of me pulsed, growing brighter, hotter, like a wound opening in the air. It wasn't just light. It was a tearing, a rending of the oppressive gloom, as if my words had struck a raw nerve, exposing something vulnerable within the entity. I stood my ground, my voice hoarse but steady. You feed on what I give you, my guilt, my sorrow, my fear. But I won't give it to you anymore. You don't deserve it. Each word felt like a stone thrown, a tiny tremor against the vast shifting mass of darkness that still enveloped me. The air grew thick, heavy with an almost metallic scent, like old blood and rust. Within its churning depths, I saw fleeting, horrifying images. My own reflection, twisted and gaunt, faces of people I'd lost, their expressions contorted in silent accusation. And then, something else. Something utterly alien and profoundly desolate. It wasn't just the house's history I was seeing, but perhaps the entity's own, a vast, echoing emptiness. I felt a tremendous, irresistible pull, a suction that threatened to tear me from where I stood. My feet scraped against the polished wood as I dug my heels in, my muscles screaming in protest. "No!" I yelled, my voice cracking but laced with a renewed defiance. "You won't have me." As I fought the pull, the shimmering vortex solidified, its edges sharpening into something resembling a doorway. And through it, I saw it. Not a room in this house, not a memory, but a place utterly devoid of life, steeped in a profound, absolute despair. Iron bars lined one side, disappearing into the gloom, hinting at cells beyond. A thick, cloying smell of stagnant water and decay hung heavy in that spectral air. This was it, the place it wanted to drag me into, the ultimate oblivion. It was the entity's true domain, and it was trying to claim me as its final permanent resident. The entity's shriek returned, a sustained, ear-splitting howl of pure, unadulterated hatred and frustration. But seeing that corridor, that ultimate prison of the soul, ignited something fierce within me. I wouldn't go. I wouldn't become another echo in its endless torment. I closed my eyes, not in defeat, but to focus, to gather every shred of my resolve. I pictured my sister, not as he was in her final moments, but vibrant, alive, laughing. I pictured my own designs, the beauty I still wanted to create, the life I still wanted to live. I wasn't denying the pain. I was acknowledging it, accepting it as part of my story, but refusing to let it define my future or become fodder for this parasitic horror. "You are nothing without me," I screamed, opening my eyes, "and I am healing." The effect was instantaneous and violent. The suction ceased abruptly, throwing me forward, stumbling but not falling. The entity was gone. Or at least its direct, tangible presence was. I stood there, trembling, my legs weak, my throat raw. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against the sudden quiet. I looked around the room. The plaster dust had settled, coating everything in a fine, ghostly layer. The house, too, was silent, its earlier groans and roars replaced by a stillness that felt profound, watchful. I had survived. I had faced it, spoken its name, and rejected its insidious offer of oblivion. The entity might have been banished, or merely pushed back into the deeper recesses of the house, but it had left an indelible mark. I had glimpsed the true horror it embodied, the vast, consuming despair that lay beneath the veneer of this old house. The house still stood, a grand, imposing structure against the fading light of dawn, which was now just beginning to filter through the tall windows. It was mine, yes, but it was also scarred, haunted not just by history, but by the raw psychological warfare I had waged within its walls. I knew then that my magnum opus would never be just an architectural marvel.